So the next part of this chapter focuses on still our special senses, and we're really going to talk about smell, which we call olfaction, and taste, which is called gustation. Both of these, if you remember, involve chemoreceptors. Remember, chemoreceptors are receptors that respond to chemicals. So these are picking up specific chemicals either in the food or in the air that you're breathing in. So we're going to start with smell. Smell is something that's initiated in this tissue called the olfactory epithelium. Remember, epithelial tissue is always a covering or a lining. So your skin is epithelium, but also lining the inside of your mouth, lining the inside of your nose. This is also epithelium. You have an area of epithelial tissue that contains receptor cells that detect odors, and that area is called the olfactory epithelium. This is actually where that cranial nerve number 1 and those little nerve roots come down in and penetrate into that epithelium. This is found on the roof of the nasal cavity. And the receptor cells that we find in that olfactory epithelium can respond to thousands of different molecules. And how they're responding to those is the chemicals in the air that you breathe in actually dissolve in the liquid. They dissolve in that mucus, and they bind to the membrane receptors on the olfactory hairs. And this is going to stimulate some nerve impulses that then get transmitted to the brain via the olfactory nerve, and the brain processes those. And the chemicals that we can smell, like I said, we can smell thousands of different molecules, and the odors range anything from pepperminty and floral to fruity and even into putrid. So we can smell all different kinds of things. Now in this image, this is a great picture. It's a sagittal view of the nasal cavity. And right here, you can see the olfactory bulb. And remember, it sits right on top of the cribriform plate. And you can see these nerve roots going through those little olfactory foramina. And now you can see here are those nerves, and they are down in that olfactory epithelium, picking up those chemicals. Now, if we look at the olfactory epithelium up close, so again, you can see this is the olfactory bulb, so that's our cranial nerve number 1. And you can see those little nerve roots kind of moving through those that cribriform plate. And then you can actually see those receptor cells, and you can see that they drill all the way down. And then you can see this layer of mucus down here. And again, that's what the chemicals are dissolving in. There are little hairs at the end of those receptors called olfactory cilia. And that is what is responding to those chemicals that are found in the air. Now, taste is pretty similar to smell. Again, these are also chemoreceptors. Taste buds are found on the surface of your tongue, and they're responding to chemicals that are dissolved in your food. Again, those chemicals in your food have to actually move into the liquid like your saliva and get down into your taste buds. They are found mostly on the upper surface of your tongue. And again, what's happening is those food molecules, those chemicals, dissolve in the liquid saliva and get down into your taste buds. We call those taste pores. Those are the holes. And inside those taste pores, there are little cilia, little hairs. We call them taste hairs, just like we had in the olfactory region. And these are going to trigger those receptor cells. And that's going to send that signal back to the brain for processing. Now we can see in this image, we're looking at a tongue, and we can see some of the different kinds of taste buds. So we have things like folate papilla, which you can see are on the sides of the tongue. These are going to pick up more of that bitter, sour taste. We also have these fungiform papilla all over the surface of the tongue. And then we have back here, it almost is the shape of an upside down V. Those are called valate papilla. You can see the word down here. So those are the valate papilla. Now, in the way back of your tongue, if you stick your tongue out, you see all these big bumps in the back. Those are not taste buds. That's actually a tonsil. That's called your lingual tonsil. So let's look at what these taste buds and taste pores look like. So this is just an example of the valate papilla. So again, let's go back. Those are the ones way back here that are shaped like a V in the back of your tongue. And so if we look at one of those up close, now you can see that there is this sort of hole, this pore here. So as the chemicals in your food dissolve in your saliva, that's going to move those chemicals down into that pore. And now you can see your taste buds. They look like little buds down in that pore. Okay. And now if we look at a taste bud up close, now you can see those little tiny hairs. So you can see what we call them gustatory hairs. And again, these are going to respond to the chemicals that are dissolved in our saliva. And they're going to send that information all the way back, back through those nerves and back to our brain for processing. And this is just trying to show you that information, the sensory information traveling towards the brain and going out to the cortex for processing. Now, the area of the cortex that's going to process taste is the gustatory cortex. Now, unlike with smell, where we can smell thousands of different chemicals, taste, we basically have 5 basic taste sensations. So this is going to include sweet. This would be from any kind of sugars like monosaccharides, saccharin, even alcohol can taste sweet. Some amino acids can also taste sweet. We also have a sour taste. This is typically from hydrogen ions. Now remember, hydrogen ions are indicative of an acid. So the more hydrogen ions you have, the more acidic something is, the more sour it's going to taste. Salty. Salty is coming from the metal ions that might be in our food. Bitter, this is coming from alkaloids, things like nicotine, aspirin. These have a bitter taste to them. And then the last flavor is something called umami, and umami is kind of a meaty flavor. MSG, for example, is that umami meaty flavor. Amino acids and aspartate, these have that umami meaty flavor. Now, there is a possible 6th taste, and it is that we can taste lipids, fatty acids, and I don't know that it's necessarily a taste per se, but more of a mouth feel. It gives the food a certain texture and a feel to it. And so this can explain maybe the fact that we like fatty foods. It has a certain texture, maybe a certain taste to it. Taste, likes, and dislikes. So what you like and what you don't like actually have value to them. This actually guides the intake of what our body needs. So there are times where, you might crave something. You might be craving carrots, and that might be because you need some beta carotene in your diet. So your body will actually cause you to crave things that you actually need. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what activates those taste receptors. Again, it's the chemicals, we call them tastants, in our food. These depolarize the taste cell membrane, and it causes a neurotransmitter to get released. So remember, when we depolarize the membrane, it means that sodium ions come in, we change that membrane potential that we find within those neurons. And this is going to initiate what's called a generator potential, which is going to lead to an action potential. So we talked a lot about action potentials in chapter 9 with muscle physiology, and we talked about these again in chapter 11 with neurophysiology. So remember, we're talking about nerves here, whether we're talking about the receptors that are picking up taste or smell. These are all nerves, nerve endings. There are different thresholds for the activation of these taste receptors. And so what that means is that there are different thresholds to lead to an action potential. Now think back to that threshold we talked about in muscle physiology. It was -50 to -55. And so the most sensitive of our taste receptors is the bitter receptor. And what that means is that the threshold might be might not be -50. It might be like -65, right? Remember, our resting membrane potential is -70. So a sensitive receptor might mean that all we have to do is change that membrane potential and bring it up to -65, just by 5. That's all we have to depolarize it, and that will trigger that bitter sensation. So that would mean that a receptor is more sensitive. The lower the threshold is for activation, the more sensitive the receptor is. And the higher the threshold is, like as we get up to -50 or up to -40, that means that it's harder to activate that particular receptor. All of your receptors, all of your taste buds will adapt within 3 to 5 seconds, and you'll have complete adaptation within 1 to 5 minutes. So, what that means is that, if you get this giant cheesecake from the Cheesecake Factory that has like 2,700 calories in it, take really slow bites, and maybe all you need is about 3 bites, because after 1 to 5 minutes, you're not really tasting it anymore. All of your taste buds have adapted to that taste sensation. Now, taste plays a huge role in lots of things. It plays a huge role in the reflexes that are involved in digestion. Digestion starts not necessarily in the stomach. It can start in the mouth when you put food in your mouth, but you can also trigger digestion and trigger your stomach making gastric juice and your stomach churning by doing other things like looking at food, smelling food, thinking about food. So it's not necessarily tasting food that triggers digestion, but it does. It will trigger digestion, but there's lots of reflexes involved in digestion. Obviously, when you taste food, think about food, look at food, all of that is going to increase saliva going into your mouth because your body says, I am ready to eat. And it's also going to cause you to make more gastric juice in your stomach. And it also sometimes can initiate some protective reactions like gagging. If you're eating something that you really don't like or something that tastes off, it can trigger you to gag, and it can also cause vomiting. Now, we can't talk about smell and taste without talking about how they are linked together. We know that smell influences our sense of taste and vice versa. If you've ever had a cold, you know this, right? If your nose is blocked, you have a lot of mucus, you typically can't taste your food. I always joke when I have a cold and say, this is my chance to eat a whole lot of vegetables. So we know that scent molecules, when you smell something, because our nasal cavity is connected to our oral cavity through the pharynx in the back of the throat, scent molecules, what you're smelling, actually go into your mouth. Those same chemicals in the air can dissolve in your saliva, just like they do in the mucus of your nose, get down into your taste pores, and stimulate those taste receptors. So, when you are at the mall and you walk by Cinnabon, and even if you don't buy a Cinnabon, when you smell it, you are kind of tasting it. It's getting down into your mouth, it's dissolving in your saliva. So they are definitely linked together. Same thing with food, what you're eating. Food molecules can actually get up into the nasal cavity through the air, through the pharynx, and stimulate that olfactory epithelium. We say that taste is 80% smell. Again, you know this because if your nose has ever been clogged, you can't taste your food very well. So we know that taste and smell are intimately linked. Now, other things that influence taste, not just smell, but also thermoreceptors. I like hot green beans, but if my green beans get kind of cold, I don't like them anymore. So temperature of your food plays a huge role in how it tastes to you. Mechanoreceptors, nociceptors. So mechanoreceptors would be like texture. As you're biting down, what's the texture? If you don't like mushy food, right? Or maybe some people I know don't like cottage cheese. My husband hates cottage cheese because of the texture. And then nociceptors, these typically pick up pain. All of these can influence taste. So temperature and texture can either make it taste better or, depending on what it is, can make it taste worse.